I would like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Macaulay now, because again, we're going to do our questions after the two talks. So Elizabeth Macaulay, known to her friends and colleagues as Lizzie, is an associate professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Her research explores the material culture of the Roman, late antique, and Islamic worlds, with particular emphasis on Roman gardens and architecture, the reception of ancient material culture in the United States, and Islamic architecture. She also serves as Deputy Director of Manal al-Athar, an open access digital humanities resource for the study of the Middle East, which of course we heard about from this morning, and that there's some information about on the reception desk as well. So welcome, Dr. Macaulay.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank Ainsley, Cameron, Sarah, Julia, Trudy, Emily, and the whole team for putting together such a wonderful symposium. I, like many of the other speakers, have not actually seen people and talked to people in like 2 years. So it's so wonderful to be able to be here. And I'd also like to thank Cameron Kitchen as well as the Mellon Foundation for the support of the galleries and the symposium. And so I'm very honored to be here today and to be able to celebrate the stunning new galleries. I also was here in, I think, 2012 or 2013 just to look at things because I had heard so much about Cam's collection. And so it's wonderful to be back to see these new galleries. I want to thank Joe Green of the Dynamic Green team from this morning because some of the research that I'm going to talk about today, his support was essential of it because it does connect to the Harvard Museum of the Ancient Near East, formerly the Semitic Museum. And lastly, I'd like to dedicate this talk to the memory of Judith Mackenzie for her knowledge of Nabatean civilization and material culture. Judith was a wonderful mentor of mine when I was in graduate school, and she took such good care of so many of us who were doing our doctorates at Oxford that we wouldn't have gotten where we'd gotten without her. So I know she's with us in spirit today and would be delighted to see so much interest in Jordan, in Nabatean civilization, Nabatean with quotation marks around it. And so with that, I'm going to take us out of Cincinnati. We're going to go to New York. In fact, we're going to Queens. So what I want to talk about today is New York City's second oldest monument, which is a Roman column in Flushing Meadows, Corona Park. And the column hails from Jerash, one of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan's preeminent Greco-Roman cities that flourished in the 2nd century CE. King Hussein of Jordan gave the column to the city of New York during the 1965-64 World's Fair. It's a really good example of what Morgul was talking about yesterday, this idea of the itinerary of objects and how when objects move from places, they undergo different stories and transformations and have different relationships. And so we often think of pots and smaller objects as moving, but in the case of the things I'm going to talk about today, we have capitals and columns moving as well. So World's Fairs are unique opportunities for nations to display their goals and their agendas to a global audience and to citizens of their host nations. Political interests of participating nations are often represented by cultural artifacts, including archaeological objects. At World's Fairs, modern states have used archaeology, history, to justify and establish and present evidence for different national agendas in domestic and international contexts. And this in many ways starts with the original kind of World's Fair, the 1851 Crystal Palace. So the column I'm going to talk about today is architecturally significant in its own right, but it's part of a larger, more complex, controversial story about Robert Moses, certainly an infamous New Yorker, the man who was chair of the Parks Department for most of the large portion of the 20th century, probably the most important unofficial elected in certainly 20th century New York history, the 1964-65 World's Fair, and the political conflicts that have engulfed the Holy Land since 1948. King Hussein's gift of the column reflects Jordan's strategy in the 1960s and 70s of using its archaeological heritage to strengthen ties with the United States by bestowing columns and capitals on American cities and institutions. And so this is where I would really argue that these objects act as kind of archaeological ambassadors. So the column also figures in the conflict surrounding competing narratives of biblical and classical history presented at the 64-65 World's Fair, and in the controversy over the inclusion of a contentious mural about Palestinian refugees in the fair's Jordan Pavilion. So the idea that there should be a present or gift of a column to New York City did not actually originate with the Jordanians, but with Hugh D. Auchincloss, a well-connected American lawyer, stockbroker, and stepfather to the future First Lady Jackie Kennedy. In 1962, he visited Jordan and other Arab countries to kind of stimulate interest and to encourage participation in the 64-65 World's Fair. While in Jordan, he met King Hussein and suggested to Jordan's foreign minister that Jordan could give a column to New York City as part of the country's participation. King Hussein assented and approved the exportation of a column as a gift from the government of Jordan to New York City. In 1964, a column showed up in New York City in 6 pieces, although it was not the one earmarked as a gift, but it was still accepted because no one wanted to tell Robert Moses they had the wrong column. Which, for any of you who know anything about Robert Moses, that was probably a good decision. The limestone column stands on a permanent cement pedestal that was installed in 1964. Now, it's located just to the west of United Nations Avenue South in Flushing Meadows in Queens. At the top part of the slide, you can see the grandstand where the US Open is played. So it shows you it's a kind of vibrant part of New York City, and as well, you can also see in the slide, just make sure I can get this. Yes, so here you can see the grandstand, here you can see the Queens Museum, the Unisphere, and the column of Jerash right over there. So during the fair, it was located just to the north of the Jordanian Pavilion. Right, oops, sorry, this has a mind of its own. All right, located right there. Now, the Corinthian capital probably dates to the 2nd century CE, based on comparison with other capitals from Jerash. And I want to talk a little bit about the modern dedicatory plaque that accompanied the column. So I'm just going to paraphrase part of it. Oh, actually, I'll read it to you. Okay, so the column of Jerash. This column was presented to New York City's World Fair and the City of New York by His Majesty King Hussein of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan on the occasion of Jordan's participation in the fair. The column was received by the Honorable Robert Moses, President and New York World's Fair 1964-65 Corporation. This is one of the many columns in a temple erected by the Romans in 120 AD that stood in the Roman city of Jerash, Jordan. The columns are known as the Whispering Columns of Jerash. Now, Jerash is located, there it goes, okay, in northern Jordan, 51 kilometers north of Amman, which in antiquity was ancient Philadelphia. Please note that. We'll come back to that in a moment. But Jerash was a major Greco-Roman city, so the gift of this column was significant. Now, the documentary evidence in the World Fair Archive in New York Public Library states that the column was from the Temple of Artemis, the most famous column in Jerash. Which you can see is in the red circle here, and here are the famous, very, very tall columns. Note the size of individuals next to it. I don't have time to discuss it in detail today, but I'm happy to do so later on at question, et cetera. But the dimensions and heights of the column that is in Queens mean it cannot come from the Temple of Artemis. Also, you can see that most of the columns are still standing, that being the big giveaway that it's not from here. All we can say is that the column probably came from Jerash due to its similarity to other Corinthian columns used in the city's much smaller scale buildings. And the column, in all likelihood, we can't actually associate it with any building in Jerash in particular. That's largely because late antique churches and other buildings reused classical columns regularly. In 749 CE, a strong earthquake hit Jerash, causing heavy damage, and street colonnades fell in certain places. Since colonnaded streets were no longer socially significant as they had been in the Roman era, colonnades were not re-erected, but the capitals, drums, bases, architraves, and other architectural fragments were reused as building materials in subsequent reconstructions. So fast forward to the 1960s, and many of the Roman period drums and capitals, which were reused in late antiquity, were moved from the streets during a large-scale cleanup and reconstruction of Jerash. This 1960s kind of cleanup coincides with the 64-65 World Fair, when the column of Jerash and other capitals were sent to the United States as diplomatic gifts. From the Jordanian perspective, a column or column capital was a highly suitable archaeological gift. Columns are large, they're monumental, they're hugely impressive. Their fine materials and scale makes an impact on viewers, especially to viewers who'd not seen ancient columns in situ. In Jordan, particularly at Jerash, columns are relatively abundant, as are capitals. Thus, a column that would be exceptional to an American city or institution was not as unique in Jordan. It was not, say, irreplaceable the way a unique piece of ancient sculpture would be. Thus, the column of Jerash struck a delicate balance between uniqueness and ubiquity. Now, the 64-65 World's Fair was held in Flushing Meadows. It ran for 2 seasons, from April to October 1964 and April to October in 1965. And in total, about 52 million people visited the fair. If you meet New Yorkers of a certain vintage, they can tell you that they were like held up so they could see the Pietà, or like my mother, she drove from Delaware to cover the fair for her school newspaper. So it was a really big deal. Now, Robert Moses, the infamous parks commissioner, most famously known through the power broker Robert Caro's very critical, rightfully so, biography, was known for his critical roads, bridges, parks, and I would say redevelopment projects in quotation marks in New York City. He destroyed huge numbers of neighborhoods, was the president of the World's Fair Corporation, and he, true to form, controlled almost every aspect of the fair. He aimed to make the fair financially successful so he could use subsequent profits to fund his final park, which would be this park at Flushing Meadows, Corona Park. So to achieve that end, he decided that fair participants should lease land from the Fair Corporation and design and build their own pavilions, which is a shift in policy. So the cost of construction went to the businesses and companies participating and allowed Moses, in theory, to maximize profits. The policy resulted in a fair that was decidedly commercial in nature and displayed a hodgepodge of architectural design, 2 elements heavily criticized at the time. Now, the motto of the fair was peace through understanding, and the centrally located Unisphere, which you can see right here, and the Unisphere is still in the park today, was one of the few lasting structures that exists in the subsequent park. While previous fairs have tended to be futuristic and focus on technological innovations, Moses's fair had a pronounced backward glance and conservative bias. It seeming to ignore the tumult of the 1960s happening outside. For example, actually Andy Warhol had done murals of 12 of the most wanted men in America, and Moses made him take them down. That gives you an idea. 2 of the most highly anticipated showings were the Pietà, which had come from the Vatican and was on the Vatican Pavilion, and then the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were exhibited both in the Jordan Pavilion and in the American-Israeli Pavilion. So there was a heavy emphasis on religion in certain aspects of the fair. So the column of Jerash, not necessarily being from biblical history, but being from classical history, kind of went well with the fair's focus on the kind of achievements of the past. So as a symbol of the past and the glory of Rome and the Roman Empire, the column was a very old monument on display and was a way of kind of showing the examples of human achievements in antiquity. Now, we should talk a little bit about the Jordanian Pavilion. So it was dedicated and ground was broken on July 2nd, 1963. And during the groundbreaking ceremony, dignitaries representing the United States, Jordan, and the World's Fair Corporation attended and exchanged formalities. In his speech to dignitaries on hand, Charles Poletti, the fair's vice president for international affairs, specifically singled out Jordan's gift of a column from Jerash. And he said, but we hope that Jordan will profit from it by giving the American people a deeper insight and a keener knowledge of the great and rich background of the people of Jordan. We are happy that Jordan is planning to give the city of New York one of the pillars from Jerash. We look forward to this column being here in this great park for many, many centuries to come to remind the people of New York of the contributions to modern civilization made by the people of Jordan. So the column of Jerash was singled out among the exhibitions of the Jordan Pavilion because it would remain as a lasting, if you will, almost a permanent monument in the post-fair park that Moses had planned. Now, Moses' decision to let participants create their own pavilions meant that many of the countries used the pavilions as a showcase for cultural heritage. And in this case, the Jordanian pavilion was no different. In the official documentation produced either by the Fair Corporation or by the creators of the Jordan Pavilion, there was an emphasis placed on the rolling hills of Jordan, which is what the roof was supposed to evoke. This is what is the kind of, if you go and read the archives, this is the kind of purposeful thought going into the architecture. The pavilion's architect, Victor H. Basharat, explained that the structure was meant to evoke Jordan's unique status as the homeland of the monotheistic faiths of Abraham, Jesus, and Muhammad. Two of the main attractions of the pavilion, the Column of Jerash and the biblical Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, highlight Jordan's rich ancient cultural and religious heritage. The Jordan Pavilion also featured a stained glass windows by Spanish artist Antonio Sara that was meant to represent the 4 stations of the cross, or Christ's journey along the Via Dolorosa on his day of crucifixion. And then on the exterior, as you can see here, these bas reliefs. So you have one here, which is the Dome of the Rock, and then you have the treasury and the monastery, or the Kashne and the Dare, located here. And so I think that's very significant because we'll go back. It's very significant because you're showing a kind of, Jordan is presenting itself as a land with a very deep religious, archaeological, and historical past, but one that is very much focused on a Christian and a Christian and a Muslim Holy Land. The other thing that's interesting, if you were to go in here, there were large numbers of brochures that you could take away. And this actually relates very nicely to kind of the points that Jack made in his paper this morning, which is this pavilion is designed to get people to go to Jordan. It is designed to encourage tourism. And so you can see this kind of emphasis on tourism in the 1960s is going to have a knock-on effect that the country is still feeling today. You can still buy the brochures on eBay. And when you go and you download them and look at them, there's a huge emphasis on going to see the Christian sites, many of which are in the West Bank today. And this was a really kind of important emphasis in the pavilion, partially because in the year before, Pope Paul VI was the first pope to actually visit the Holy Land. And the majority of the Christian holy sites that he visited were located within Jordan. So the whole pavilion becomes another way to kind of present Jordan not only as a place with rich ancient history in terms of the Nabateans, in terms of kind of the Roman Empire, but also specifically as a place with Christian sites that would appeal to a particular American audience, a Christian American audience that would like to then come to Jordan and visit these holy sites for tourism. So what's interesting is not too far away, the American Israel Pavilion also exhibited Dead Sea Scrolls. So both of these two pavilions are kind of claiming the past and the architectural and archaeological heritage of the site of Khirbet Quaram in the West Bank as kind of their spaces and spaces that they control kind of the archaeological narratives around. So it's not surprising then that in some ways these spaces got political. And we can see that in a mural that was erected and placed in the Jordanian pavilion. It was a wall-sized mural about Palestinian refugees that was highly political and provocative in nature. And I think it's important because not only can we see history being used, but we can also see kind of contemporary events playing out in these world's fairs. And so the goal here was really to place emphasis on the displaced Palestinian refugees and, from the Jordanian perspective, the world's indifference to their plight. So specifically, the poem asks people to, quote unquote, hear a word on Palestine and to help wrong a right. The poem presents an idealized version of the past where, quote unquote, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, believer in one God, lived there in peaceful harmony until strangers from abroad arrived and stealthily bought up land, thereby sowing seeds of trouble. So clearly a vast oversimplification of the very complex history of the Middle East. But it's an interesting thing that this is here alongside the Dead Sea Scrolls, a column from Jerash, a presentation of some of the major architectural monuments that you could go and visit. So it immediately, of course, set off a huge amount of controversy. The pavilion was picketed by members of the Jewish American community and a lot of New Yorkers. Robert Wagner, who was the mayor at the time, thought it should be removed. Robert Moses said it doesn't matter, it should stay there, and can't everyone be quiet and just go to the fair? Because that was his answer to everything. So he's not supporting the Jordanian position, he's just supporting the I don't want controversy at the fair. Now, King Hussein of Jordan gave interviews about the mural saying, and this was he was quoted in the New York Times as saying, "I don't believe that this particular portrait of a refugee boy is against any particular people. It is appeal to the conscience of the people. It is a humanitarian problem, and since there are such problems, it is worthwhile to bring them to the world. I don't think there's any reason for the extreme reaction to its being here." So what's interesting is I think in some ways the mural might seem at odds with the historical narratives that we see in the Jordan Pavilion, but it's very much closely tied up with the Jordanian national identity and the politics of Jordan's kind of position within the Arab world relative to the question of the Palestinians. And so in this sense, King Hussein is also positioning himself within the politics of the Arab world and kind of positioning himself as a leading voice for the Palestinian cause. So unsurprisingly, there was controversy. Eventually, there was back and forth about removing the mural. It went to the New York State Supreme Court, which said the mural could stay and people could picket, but they couldn't hand out pamphlets. So it's an interesting kind of microcosm of the perpetual kind of political and PR war that has kind of continued over political issues in that part of the world to this day. So the column of Jerash can be set against the back of this. Now, after the fair, though, and I'm going to continue on because I will be out of time shortly, is that this was not a one-off. In fact, Jordan kind of almost, if you'd say, have a practice. I don't know if policy is the right word. I have to think that through a little bit more. But continued to give columns and capitals to various East Coast institutions and cities. So Harvard got a capital, which was in the Semitic Museum. In 1966, the University of Pennsylvania received 2 capitals that are currently in the courtyard of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Now, Princeton also got these 2 capitals, and these are kind of interesting. These were given in 1965, and they were misidentified as Roman. They are Umayyad from the early 8th century, from the Umayyad Palace of Al-Mubarak, and apparently they were in the Amman Museum in the 1960s, and they were given. So it's kind of an interesting thing in terms of who controls the narratives and how archaeological objects move. It would seem that it was approved at a very high level of government that they were allowed to be given. And they were given in part for Princeton's creation of a Department of Near Eastern Studies. So what's interesting is it seems to be that the Jordanian government, and perhaps King Hussein in particular, were thinking about how these objects could cement relationships between the United States, American institutions, and Jordan as well. The other thing that is circulating at the same time, and this is very much connected to Morga's work on following the pots, which is we also have, they're in quotation marks, Dead Sea Scroll jars. I would say jars of the Dead Sea Scroll variety, which may or may not have had Dead Sea Scrolls in them, because I was trying to fit it all on one slide. But there are also at least one jar that's given to the Metropolitan Museum of Art that is connected to the 64-65 World Fair, suggesting that also not only is there a classical narrative going on, but also one that is biblical. And so there's a larger practice going on where the sharing of objects, the gifting of objects legally seems to be part of what the Jordanian government was doing to build and foster relationships with the United States. And obviously the Follow the Pots project, where objects were sold legally, is part of this larger conversation. The last thing to say is that Philadelphia also gets a column because, of course, from one Philadelphia Amman to another Philadelphia was the story. And so this column was given to the city of Philadelphia in 1976 to celebrate the bicentennial of the United States. So in conclusion, because I'm almost out of time, the column of Jerash is one of the few architectural and archaeological remains from the 1964-65 World's Fair. And the gift of this column and other columns and capitals serves as, I think, an important case study in King Hussein's use of archaeological objects to forge cultural, political, and diplomatic relationships. The larger context of the gift, the 64-65 World's Fair and the Pavilion, provided Jordan with a really important venue to promote tourism by establishing Jordan as the Holy Land and connecting it to a kind of shared, quote-unquote, Western antiquity. Thus, King Hussein was able to use the occasion of the fair also to opine on the political implications of the founding of Israel and on the predicament of Palestinian refugees in the region. So even though everything else was basically torn down, the column remains. And it's no longer a kind of memorial just to the greatness of Jerash and to ancient Jordan, but it's also a kind of reference to the classical past and to a kind of a specific moment in American and global history. It serves as a physical embodiment of the use of archaeological objects as ambassadors to promote political aims and to forge ties between nations. Thank you.